I made Chopper's hat, and I'm going to tell you guys how I did it. I think that was a good enough intro. I'm Rue, and I made this Chopper hat about probably 3 years ago, so it's been a while since I made it, and I don't have any video of me actually making it, but I did take a bunch of pictures, which I'm going to use those to help explain what I did here, because I've had a few people ask me how I made the hat or if I can make one for them, and this took me quite a bit of time in figuring out, so I wanted to share with you guys how I did it. So I have a little script off to the side because it's been so long since I made this hat that I needed to write down all the details so that I hopefully don't forget anything super important as I'm telling you guys about how I did this. So let's get started. As I'm explaining everything, I will put up pictures on the screen so you guys can get a better idea of what I'm talking about and what the materials look like when they are completely unpainted, unfinished, all that kind of stuff. The very first thing I did was make the brim of the hat. So this big old part right here, I'll give you a little inside look. This is why you don't look at the insides of cosplays most of the time, unless people are like super professional. I wouldn't say that's me. But this is what the brim looks like from the front and from the bottom. The first thing I encountered while doing the brim of the hat was figuring out how big I wanted it to be, because I wanted this hat to be kind of larger than life. Hold on, let me close this door. They are so loud. Anyways, I wanted to figure out how big I wanted the hat to be because I wanted it to be something that's larger than life because, you know, Chopper is a little guy and I wanted this to look like, you know, I was a little guy wearing a big hat. So I wanted to make it big. And the thing that I found that was actually the perfect size was a large metal dog bowl that we were not using. The materials I used for the brim are EVA foam sheets and then insulation foam board. So I'll let you guys see inside here, but that green bit right here, that is the insulation foam board, and all of this right here, and this right here, and this right here is EVA foam. I used the insulation foam board as something sturdy for the brim because I didn't want it to be like too bendable. I wanted it to be very, you know, sturdy, firm. But insulation foam board is also very kind of brittle and breaks easily. So I wanted something on top of that too that can kind of protect the insulation foam board. Plus the insulation foam board, I feel like just wasn't the best material for me to paint on and everything. So I wanted to cover it with some EVA foam. So I used a layer of EVA foam on the bottom, onto the top, and then on the side. As for the head hole, the part that my noggin goes in, I needed to figure out how big I was gonna make this. And in cosplay and a lot of things where you are crafting, always start with something smaller because you can always make it bigger, but it's a lot harder to make the big thing smaller. So what I did was cut a kind of tinier circle into the foam, and then I put it on my head, and then I realized it was too small, so I'd cut a bigger hole, and then I'd keep going until eventually it was bigger than my head, which wasn't actually intentional at first, but it actually helped a lot because when I wear this without a wig, it goes right over my head. But when I put a wig on, which I wear with my Chopper cosplay, it fits snugly on top of the wig. So making it a little bit bigger than your head is actually a little helpful if you plan to wear a wig. So after I cut everything out, it was time to assemble the pieces together. I did an oopsie with that. I decided to use contact cement to try to adhere the EVA foam to the foam board. Contact cement does melt the insulation foam board. So even though it melted it, I was still able to glue them together, and it still turned out all right. But that is a warning that if you try to use that on the insulation foam board, it will start melting it and you will start getting little craters and everything. So maybe use something else like, I don't know, craft glue. Hot glue is still gonna like melt it. I don't know. There's other glues that you can try to use that aren't as aggressive on the insulation foam board. So yeah, that's how I put them together. Once I had the brim all assembled, I had to figure out I had to look this up. This is called the crown of a hat. So I had to figure out the crown of the hat, the big barrel cylinder thing on top. This part is just made out of EVA foam. It's made out of a long rectangle for this part right here, and then a circle-ish, not exactly perfect circle, a circle-ish part that fits right on top of the cylinder, and that's all this is made out of. To figure out how long of a rectangular piece I needed, I just cut one that's bigger, definitely bigger than what I needed, wrapped it around the whole of the hat, and then marked it and then cut the piece, and that's how I got the crown cylinder piece. And all I did for these pieces were just use contact cement to adhere the cylinder crown onto the brim, and then use contact cement to put the circle on top of the cylinder. Okay, so now I had a hat. Now I had to make it look like Chopper's hat. But first, just to make sure everything looked nice and smooth, I used a bit of foam clay that I wet a little bit. That way I can fill in any kind of cracks or any uneven spots between the circle and the cylinder, or if there are any gaps between the cylinder and the brim of the hat, I would just use some foam clay to fill in those spaces, let it dry, sand it down, and that way everything was nice and smooth. But now that we had everything nice and smooth, it was time to rough it up a little bit. Now, since the live action One Piece trailer came out for season 2, Chopper's hat was fuzzy. And I think it was always meant to be fuzzy, but I really wanted it to look like the anime, so I was trying to go based off of looks rather than the texture and everything. Plus, doing it out of EVA foam instead of some kind of fake fur lets me put in little details such as these little scratches and notches, which I'm going to tell you about now. All of these little dashes right here are actually indented into the hat, and I did that by taking an X-Acto knife, or I think probably just a box cutter, honestly, and I just cut some very shallow lines into the hat, used a heat gun to set those lines and make them a little bit wider. And then for the little notch that I have up here, I just really dug in there with a box cutter, took a chunk out, and that's how I got those pieces. But now we have these really cool, texture lines, and yeah, it adds just a little bit more character to the hat. Now it was time for me to prime and paint the hat. I just used some Plasti Dip in a spray can to cover the hat completely, and I believe I did 2 coats of it just to make sure everything is nice and primed and protected. And using the Plasti Dip also helps you to get a nice surface for you to use your acrylic paints on, because the EVA foam will absorb the paints and then you have to use more layers of paint and all that kind of stuff. So Plasti Dip first and then paint. So I am not a color theory expert by any means. Color theory is still a mystery to me. And figuring out what color his hat is just, it's a whole adventure, because it's clearly like a pinkish red color, but if you just take red and white, you're gonna get a pink that looks nothing like this. So I had to find a workaround for that, because I had no idea how to get this color, because this is about as close to the anime as I could possibly get it. What I did was I found an app on my phone that is kind of a color picker app, where you can take a picture of something, tap on any part of it, and it will tell you exactly the RGB, or the red, green, blue of that color. I used that as a guide to help me figure out what I needed to add to the paint in order to get it more of this color, as opposed to just like a light pink. Because when I look at this color, again, I think white and red, but it does take some green, it takes some blue. So using that helped me a lot. And fun little fact, this color on the app that I was using is actually called Fuzzy Wuzzy. So I think that's very fitting for our little Fuzzy Wuzzy Chopper. Once I painted the entire hat Fuzzy Wuzzy, including the bottom here, that's when I moved on to the cuts here that I made earlier. Now, before I did that, I made sure everything was completely dry first, because when I made these cuts, I wanted to make them a little bit more noticeable than just being the same color as the rest of the hat. So to do that, I took a very, very diluted black paint, and I did a wash where I just put some of that over each of the cuts, and then I wiped away the excess. So now I had the pink base and the little details in there, and it was time to move on to the X on the front of the hat. And that I just freehanded. I used a pencil first to mark out where I want the X. That way I can erase the bits if I, messed up, which I'm pretty sure I did at some point. Once I drew out what I thought looked good in pencil, then I just filled it all in with white acrylic paint. And I was just going to leave it like that, but as you can see, I did outline the X. And the first thing I tried, which did not work out for me, was trying to use a very thin paintbrush and just using black paint to outline the X, but it ended up too thick, the lines were too wobbly, all that. So I actually just used a pen instead, just a ballpoint pen that was very thin, and drew it. And it made it look much cleaner. It made it look much neater. And at that point, I had a painted hat. And to protect the paint and lock everything in, I just used a matte clear coat in a spray can and just all over. I think I did probably 2 to 3 coats just to lock everything in. I think the most difficult part of this entire hat was figuring out how I was gonna do these antlers, because I'll tell you what, I was stumped on those for a little bit. I wasn't sure what I wanted to make them out of. I wasn't sure how to form them, how to make them hold in a good position. So I did some thinking, and then I did a lot more thinking, and then I did even more thinking, and I finally came up with an idea. What I did was I took some aluminum foil, nothing too thick, and I rolled it up into the length that I wanted each individual one of these to be. So each one of these has a little roll of tin foil in them. All of the pieces of aluminum foil I covered with foam clay, but I did a thin layer of foam clay first, let it air dry, did another layer, let it air dry, and I kept doing that, not worrying about how smooth they were until I got to the final layer when they were about the right girth per antler. And that's when I focused on smoothing everything out. Along with each individual one of these, I did have to make a little arm, I guess you can call it, that was going to come out of the hat and then connect to the antlers themselves. So in total for each side, I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it was a total of 12 hot dogs made of foam clay. Once everything was dry, I took a little piece of EVA foam, which is actually this little part right here, and I just glued each of these parts onto it, used foam clay to smooth everything together to make it look like one cohesive unit rather than 5 individual pieces. And then I also glued this just to the bottom of the EVA foam piece. Once that was all dry, it was time to plasti dip it and then paint it. So I just painted it with acrylic paint and the antlers were done. Also, if you see these lights, that was from Holiday Matsuri because it's a holiday convention and I wanted him to look like, you know, one of Santa's reindeer. So that's why those are there. The next part, I had to figure out how was I going to attach these to the hat, because I figured if I just glued it to the exterior of the hat, there was a chance that they would break off, because it's not that these are heavy, but if something like hit it the wrong way, it's gonna, you know, just break off completely. So I went with something that I was kind of really scared to do at first, because I had to cut a big old hole here. You can actually see there's a lot of glue from repairs over the years, but I cut a big hole here and then I just shoved the antler in there. And on the inside, you can see that there's this little EVA foam piece here. So once I pushed the antler inside, I glued a piece of EVA foam onto it so that it would just, you know, stay a little bit better. It wouldn't like fall through the hole. And then I just sealed it all with a bunch of hot glue, and that's, it's stayed on there pretty well for the past few years, so something's working. And also Chopper's antlers would not be Chopper's antlers without adding the little metal piece here. The little metal piece that holds together the broken antler. To make that, I just used a rectangle of EVA foam, used some puffy paint to make the little rivets that stick up. I think they're called rivets, maybe. Let those dry, covered it in plasti dip, covered it in silver paint, and then just glued it around the antler. And the very last piece of this hat was making the little ears, because Chopper would not be in his reindeer form without his little Chopper ears. To make these, I just took small pieces of Warbler, used some heat to form it into the shape that I wanted since it is a thermoplastic. Once it cooled down, it was nice and hard, so these are staying in the position that they are set in. And then I just took some fake fur, glued it on top, and that's how I made the ears. And then those just glued on with hot glue onto the hat. Just a small detail too, when I was working on the fur for the ears, I made sure that the fur was going this way. So if I go like this, you can see, whoop. I made sure the flow of the fur is in the direction that the flow of the fur would have been on, you know, a real life reindeer or Chopper. And I did that for both sides just for consistency. And it's just one of those small details that I thought was a nice little thing. And that's how I made my Chopper hat. Also, if you're curious about these right here, I did get the hat signed by Ian Sinclair, who voices Brooke in the English dub, and then Robbie Damon, who voices Odin in the English dub. One other thing too is it kind of looks a little bit worn with the color of the pink, because I used an airbrush machine to dust a very light pink on the edges here just to give it that kind of worn down look. If there's anything that I missed about this hat that you're curious about, feel free to comment, because I want to help you guys out if you ever plan to make one of these, or if you have any questions about certain cosplay aspects, I'd love to chat with you about that too. If you do end up making a Chopper hat, please tag me. I want to see it. I want to see your creations. I want to see your Chopper cosplays. And thanks for watching, guys. I hope everything was kind of clear. Again, I didn't have any video for it, so I hope the pictures and the explanation were good enough for now. But I will try in the future for cosplay pieces that I'm making to take video of them, so that way I can just show you guys what I did. And that's all for Chopper. Bye, guys!